All right. Hello. Welcome to the Launch Notes podcast. I'm Blake from Launch Notes. Thrilled to be joined today by Chris Butler. Chris is a lead product manager on Google's core machine learning team. He's got experience in product orgs at a ton of exciting companies like Facebook, Waze, and Microsoft. He's also got great experience standing up and running product ops teams, which we want to dive into a lot today. Chris, welcome to the Launch Notes podcast. Thanks a lot for being here today.
Great. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk more about product ops.
Maybe we can start with just kind of a quick overview of your background and your journey into product work, how you got into this exciting world to begin with.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, I grew up, my dad was a very creative person. He was an art director for print ads. And so grew up around a lot of kind of the creative world. I ended up being the mechanical for him to, do stuff where he was doing really old school graphic design, and I was using Quark Express and Adobe Illustrator, and even started to help him really build out the proto websites for a lot of his clients. So from a very early age, I was used to doing commercial work from a creative standpoint. But then, totally disappointed him by going into engineering school rather than art school. And from there, sold out even further after graduating to go into program management at Microsoft. And so I guess the things that I find really interesting is just always trying to figure out the new rules for a new circumstance or context. And so like a lot of the job roles that I've had, they tend to have like technology terms inside of them because we don't know what to do with them yet. So it was like the transition from desktop software to like web or web to mobile, or the idea of like application of AI or machine learning or virtual reality or whatever, right? There's all these like kind of transitionary points for how we start to build technology that actually helps people in some way. And so that, I think that's something I find really interesting and really exciting. And then from there, I'm always very interested in like high uncertainty types of situations, which is why I think I'm drawn to product management, is just being able to understand what is the appropriate uncertainty, what things should we make more certain for our teammates that want more certainty, like designers or engineers. And then how do we really kind of continuously evolve with the marketplace, with our customers, with the world itself. And so I'd say that's what's really driven me across my various experiences, and definitely a lot of different types of experiences as product manager.
Yeah, I got to tell you, you're taking me back to my college newspaper days with the Quark and Illustrator references there. That's
totally. I was on the high school newspaper and did a lot of the layout. One of the things I did back in high school was the video game strategy guide company, where I was doing all the production for kind of layout of like Street Fighter Alpha strategy guides. So I did a lot of design stuff.
Yeah. No, I had plenty of late nights with doing newspaper layouts in Illustrator, so I know that I know how fun that can be. But I love what you I love the phrasing around like figuring out the new rules and the references to platform shifts. And not to go on a tangent about my old career, but it does remind me of part of why I actually moved out of print newspapers into tech was definitely we were feeling the rules changing and platform shift, and just wanting to get out of like reactive mode into sort of building the kind of building and deciding the the new future. So that's just like a really cool phrase. I think that's it's obviously meaningful to you. I just really like that.
And it's constantly changing. It's constantly changing too, because like the moment that we feel like we know what the rules are, the world moves forward, right? And so I think that there's a really great kind of managerial science paper from the 80s about dominant logic theory, which I reference a lot because I think it's just trying to constantly remind myself and my teams that, we may think we have figured it out right now, but there will be a change where the context is different, the environment is different, the customers are different, the problems are different. And so from there, if we try to apply our older mindsets or mental models or rules to the new world, we will be overconfident and probably make more mistakes than we would usually. And so that's my goal as kind of a product manager, is to constantly remind people of this evolution over time.
That's amazing. Dominant logic theory. I'll have to look up
Yeah.
that paper and find that as a reference and throw that out there because it
Yeah,
sounds
totally.
super fascinating. And these are the most fun and challenging types of interviews because here we are 2 minutes in. I can already tell there's like seven different things. It's like seven different things that I could probably spend 2 hours on each, just
Totally.
deciding where to go. But appreciate the sort of breadth of knowledge you bring to the table. It's super awesome. But maybe let's start with product ops. And I
Hmm.
know you've used the phrasing product managing the product management experience, if I have that right.
Yeah.
I'd love for you to unpack a little bit about what you mean by that and kind of how that sort of shapes your approach to product ops.
Yeah, I mean, when I first started getting kind of like learning about product operations, I guess I had always tried to do the things that product ops is trying to do, which I think is really,
Hmm.
focused on how do we make product management teams as effective as possible in some
Hmm.
way. And um, what I guess I've seen in other operations types of roles, like there's basic business ops, which usually is out of the finance team, right? There's
Hmm.
DevOps, which is we wanted to do a better job of handoff between engineering and operations.
Hmm.
There's design and research ops, which is more about like organization of systems and things like that. And then even, I think product ops has focused an awful lot, at least from the standpoint of say Melissa Perry or Pendo has
Hmm.
thought a lot about it from the standpoint of how do we build better systems for product managers to use. I
Hmm.
guess I've tried to push it a step further, which is, product managers as a group, we are constantly trying to understand our customers and build things that solve the problems that they have in some meaningful way. And so
Hmm.
the reason why I kind of say I'm PMing the PM experience is that I don't, again, I don't want to mistake the wrong customer that I'm really targeting, because I think there is a
Hmm.
hazard or an anti-pattern inside of product operations where if you mistake the end customer as your customer, you will actually just do all kind of the part of my French, like bullshit work for product managers. And so like
Hmm.
PMing the PM
Yeah.
experience means that I'm hyper focused on the product manager as my customer. And I think there's two products that really come out of that. And one of them is the community of practice, which is how do product managers work together, right? How does that community of practice interact with other functions like engineering, design, even leaders? And,
Hmm.
and then finally, the second major component or product is really what is the individualized experience for each product manager? Because I think there's a lot of times that if we are very process centric, we think about the cohesion of the entire system or how well the system works, rather than the fact that the system is made up of people interacting with each other.
Hmm.
And so that's why I think we need to constantly go between these two different kind of like viewpoints. And so I think that's something interesting about like product management in general, is that there's never like one perfect answer. And so
Hmm.
in the case of product operations, if we just over focused on the individual experience, we'd never get anything done for the organization. But if we only focused on the organization, we would trample all over this idea that like people want to do meaningful work in some way, and they want to enjoy their work, and they want to work with people they want to work with. And so I think
Yeah.
it's those two kind of like points on a spectrum that I think are really interesting and important.
Yeah, yeah, that's super interesting, and I'm glad that I'm glad that you call out the sort of falling into the trap of just sort of doing like BS work, or maybe
Yeah.
it's just sort of being in like reactive mode or sort of like a sort of servitude kind of function where it's just like
Yep.
I'll just sort of sit over here and tune things that the PMs tell me to do or whatever
That's
that
right.
might look like. I think that there's probably two things that probably keeps a lot of smart folks out of the
Hmm.
product operations opportunity, which is a shame. And also probably some great product operations folks get kind of fall into that trap. And, I don't know, I'd love to hear any kind of like tactical tips or strategies you would suggest for folks to not, to be
Yeah.
sure they're not kind of like falling into that place.
Well, yeah, I think the key thing is just making sure that there's clear expectations a lot of the time, that when you're working with the product managers, your job is not to help them like do customer work. Like I think
Hmm.
that is one of the key things. The moment that you start being there to help with the customer, the end customer,
Hmm.
that's when you start to fall into this thing where it's like, oh, well, this product ops person is just there to make sure that my process is super efficient, and that sometimes means that they have to pick up kind of the glue between these processes. And
Hmm.
so a lot of the time, like what I end up doing, especially when starting on a new team, is really it's about meeting and talking to almost everybody on the team. And then it's building cadences to be able to get feedback from them on how well all of these different things are working for them. And so, a lot of the time, I think product ops people are brought in and they're being told like, hey, I need you to go and like create this process around road mapping, or I need a process around X, Y, or Z. When the reality is like, what you should first do is understand what are the problems of the actual community and what are the problems for the organization that product management could be solving better. So it could be a better road mapping process, but it could also just be that like the roadmaps we have are not actually being read or used or updated in a way that makes sense. And so I think then you fall into this trap sometimes as a product operations person that your job is just there to choose a tool for road mapping, when the reality is you need to really understand at a deep, innate level what are the frictions that product managers are having in working better with engineering or design or whoever. And so road mapping, like as a topic, generally, like if a leader is saying they need a better road mapping process, it usually means that they don't understand what the teams are doing, and they don't necessarily have a high amount of trust for them. And so just adding another road mapping tool or providing a different way for them to micromanage them is not going to solve that dynamic. And so the dynamic will be solved, though, by providing much better feedback mechanisms between the context that the leaders have and the context that the individual product managers have, and finding ways that we can start to, like, where should we align? Right? Like, where are the times that we may be doing duplicative work across many teams? And again, I'm talking at a very large scale, right? The team that I work for is like 1,000+ people with like a very large product team. But I think when you talk about like smaller teams that are tens of people, it could just mean like, how do we do a better job of actually having good conversations? How do we do a better job of having good meetings? And so a lot of my time is actually spent coaching directors of product management so that they create better containers for the meetings that they have, that they don't even, I think like one of the most worthless meetings is the hand down meeting where, a director of product will sit in a room and just talk at their staff for like 45 minutes. Right. When the reality is like, just send that as an email, you know what I mean? Or record it as a video and send it like so that people can watch it whenever they want to. What you want though is you want like a good discussion about like, what are the challenges? What are the controversies? What are the things that really we should be focusing on to make sure we're learning from each other? And there's a whole bunch of stuff. I did a talk that's called how to make learning look more like work. And it's really a lot about how we need to learn an awful lot of tacit knowledge to be good at product management. And the biggest mistake we can make is thinking that the fact that a product manager is usually on a cross-functional team by themselves, that they'll get all of the feedback that they need from other practitioners in their role. And so rather than that handout meeting, we should be spending time to learn, how does that senior leader think about decision-making, right? How does that senior leader actually do this? Or how do my peers actually handle this type of problem? And so I think there's way more we could do within product teams. And I think product ops plays a role in like reminding people of this. Like, part of my job is just to ask people, like, before this product review meeting, like, what are you hoping to get out of this meeting? And a lot of the time they're like, I'm not sure, I was just going to do this meeting. And so even just asking silly, stupid seeming questions like that will get you way more focused on like, how do you actually make the use of time, which I would argue every team struggles with, is time management when we get down to it. And it's because they do not properly prioritize their own time. They may be experts at prioritizing work, but they are horrible at prioritizing their own time. So I spend a lot of time just like asking people, is this meeting necessary? Could this meeting be something else? So
no, great insights throughout all that. Really appreciate it. And I'd love to maybe drill into, you referenced a couple of times sort of like scale of like large team versus small teams. Yeah. Are there particular benchmarks or markers or indicators for, say, a smaller product org that doesn't have product ops yet, that, hey, it might be helpful or advantageous to, think about a product ops function at this time?
Yeah. I mean, this is something where I've seen ratios within the industry that are somewhere in the range of like, there's a product ops person for every kind of group or cross-functional team that's out there. So that's like, it's like 1 to 2, 3, 4 PMs, one product ops person to 1, 2, 3, 4 PMs. I think actually I tend to want to operate from a scarcity standpoint. And what I mean by that is that like, I've actually been in teams where the ratio is 1 to 50 or 1 to 100. And even though it was hard to get some things done, it meant that we were hyper focused on that. And the biggest problem or like a anti-pattern I've seen for product ops people is that they over focus on process. And so then the team gets bombarded with new processes all the time. And they're never able to actually set up like a good cadence in how they do their work. And so I would just say, like, I would prefer that we had less product ops people that were really hyper focused on the most important things to actually work on and processes to implement. And then making sure that we're actually implementing them correctly. We're gathering feedback. And so to me, it's like slow product management, right? Like there's like some value to that kind of calming and slowing down. And honestly, even for very large teams of product managers, there is a real issue that like from the abundance, you stop prioritizing correctly. And so I don't know, I kind of like feel like product ops people, for me, that's more important is it's not that we're going to like solve every single problem. Like a lot of the problem solving needs to be emergent out of the teams themselves because it's contextual. But if we see that there's a systemic problem across all of these teams, that's the product ops person should be able to step in and like push back on the managers. Like one of the things I get as a request from a lot of managers, like I want a new status process. And my question to them is like, why do you want a new status process? And, like what are the times it's actually worked? When has it been helpful? What do you actually hope to get out of this? And if it's more of a safety blanket, right, I can set up a lot of meetings where you meet and greet with people to understand the tempo of the business. But if it's really because you need to like intervene in decision making, that's a different problem altogether. And so, anyways, I'm very anti-status, and I try not to be, but like it's one of those things that's like for a long time when I was just an individual contributor, if like you wanted to know how my project is going, just come to one of my meetings. You know what I mean? Like you'll learn way more instinctively or kind of like intuitively from the fact of how we're actually working together, rather than me filling out 3 bullet items that you're not going to read or understand because it's not contextualized for you.
Yeah, that's you're touching on a lot of really key stuff. I think that I wish more folks would take to heart. I love the commentary around process and a little context. The last startup I was at, we were kind of a no-code workflow builder tool. So we spent a lot of time with customers kind of diving into their internal processes and helping them build out kind of workflows to manage each process, and did a lot of process thinking. And it's amazing, so many kind of these modern tech orgs that we are inside of, like, have gotten so modern and, agile or whatever you want to call it around how you build the actual product. But so much of the internal process thinking has not like got the memo or something, or like the way we build like internal workflows, internal processes has not sort of like caught up. Or it's just like, we're doing like waterfall, like monolith style thinking with the way we do, internal process. Things are very sort of agile and iterative on the product facing side, but often the actual like internal company processes, it can be like, like you said, folks over focus on process. They tend to try to like waterfall style build too much at once. And then it becomes like very rigid and unflexible. Like treat it like you build product, like start small, get feedback, iterate, add and adapt and adjust over time. It doesn't have to be this, legacy style. We built this mega process 12 years ago, and we gotta follow it to the T today, like no questions asked. So it's great kind of commentary. I think that's interesting. Yeah.
That's why it's like so hard, I think, for people to also iterate on their process, is that we don't take that mindset approach that we're going to experiment with things and then see what works and adjust. It feels like we have to, in some way do this type of big bang kind of process change when it's actually not good. I mean, I've been part of organizations that have seen a lot of like org change type of work. And usually the big org change kind of efforts fail. Like it's some humongous percentage of them actually fail. But if you end up trying to find a way to build success inside of smaller teams around new processes and allow that to spread more organically, it's much more likely to actually take hold. And so, I don't know, one of the things I do a lot, just as like a very tactical thing, is I try to frame processes as like, here's the starting point. This is this is the beginning. We're going to experiment with this. And then here's the planned times that we're actually going to get feedback and evolve this process, right? And so I think that is really important to include, because people there's like this fear that they get once you start saying that here's the new process. They're like, I'm going to have to live with this process for the rest of my life. Right.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's scary for people.
Yep.
Right. And especially if like they've been burned by process change previously, they're very likely to not want to do that type of thing. So framing things as experiments, framing things as very small efforts, doing small pieces over time. And then, you know, also just like giving people a break sometimes, right? Like recently we've been trying to evolve this one process. And, you know, people are just like, hey, there's a lot of process change happening right now. And so I'm like, okay, well, so we'll pause this part of it until later to try out, because again, we're not there to be a burden. We're there to really help people be better at their jobs. And some of the time, like, maybe this actually goes to the idea of like, what are the constraints inside the organization, like enabling constraints from the world of like complexity. Complexity theory is like, there's a real value to actually setting certain rules. Right. It's kind of like the idea of like why strategy is helpful is because if you could do anything, it becomes really hard to know what to do that's right. But if you set more specific kind of frameworks, and that could be this over that statement. So I've done a lot of talks around like strategy and road mapping and things like that. But like if you're talking about it as like trade-offs, I think for people, they are more able to actually build out models and then also end up building better prioritization methodologies from the standpoint that they have this like working set of like this over that, or here's the edges of what we want to do as an organization. And I think it's every leader's real kind of, it's their job to make those hard decisions much easier. And so if they don't do that type of thing, right, people end up going in a lot of different directions. There's a lot of like course adjustment that happens, which is upsetting, right? And there's like alignment becomes harder to do, which is also costly. And so I think that's like, we talk about the constraints we build as far as process is it's meant to actually make things go faster in certain cases or be more understood. And so there's a great phrase from like the Navy SEALs about how like, slow is smooth and smooth is fast. And so like, it's about this idea that as you build practice, you're actually doing things in a way that's much more kind of intuitive. And so I think of as enabling constraints within a team or how you build better meeting containers. Sometimes that kind of structure helps you actually get the job done faster, even though people may feel like, oh, well, are we constraining ourselves too much right now? So
yeah, totally. And it's easy to lose sight of like the long-term goal with these, these improvements where it's like, you're intentionally doing something that you will then go do many, many iterations of. Like you will have this, status meeting or, report meeting or handoff or whatever. Like there will be many, many cycles of it. So what you're doing in sort of tuning and honing the way it's done now is like, it's an upfront cost, but you're investing in long-term efficiency and you're investing in the kind of compounding effect of like, hey, we made this, N% more efficient, smoother, faster by taking the time up front. And now we get to realize those returns over the next, many quarters, years, whatever.
Yeah, and I maybe want to make a distinction too about effectiveness versus efficiency, because I see efficiency as like a following indicator that you have a team that works well together, whereas effectiveness, I think, is like, are people feeling like the work they're doing is actually making an impact in some way? I think is a really it's more important to actually focus on from a product ops perspective, because I think again, an anti-pattern you can fall into around efficiency is that like, did we do something as fast as possible? But the problem is we didn't actually get people to align in the appropriate way, or we didn't make the best decision or something like that. And so I think the quality aspects of this are really hard to actually discern quantitatively, but they are important for us to like focus on. So I always like to make that distinction. It's like efficiency versus effectiveness.
That's a great distinction. And good call out. Maybe change gears a little bit. We talked a little bit before recording about just the kind of question around how technical PMs need to be. And I know you've got some strong opinions on this. So I'll let you take it from here. Where do you kind of stand on the PM, technical skill dilemma?
Well, I got, the reason why this has been top of mind for me is I set a provocation during kind of like an extended leads meeting, cross functionally. And definitely, it's like one of those moments where I made a statement that I don't think, product managers should not be technical. And in fact, they should not be they work with very technical people, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
I work on a team that is full of basically the best in the machine learning world inside of
Yeah.
Google. And so
Sure. Yeah.
incredibly technical people, right? Like really, really smart, really, really understand the deep technical questions that are
Mm-hmm.
there. But when I said this statement that I don't think PM should be technical, it was like almost like a gasp from the audience that was there. But I think like what we fall into is that like I've been an engineer previously. I've actually worked as an engineer on projects where I was also a PM. And
Mm-hmm.
I would argue that I will never be technical enough, quote unquote. Like there have been plenty of times I've done technical product management interviews where people have said, you don't seem very technical. And the reason why they've said that is because I've focused an awful lot on the customer or the problem or user research or something like that. And I think when we talk about like who is meant to be technical, it's the people that are doing the technical work. And I would argue that we do a disservice to the team by not building the appropriate tensions where, you know, if there are enough technical people on the team, you need to have a way to talk about the trade-offs of these technical topics. But you as a product manager should not be making technical decisions. That's not your job. And so it's kind of like, you know, I think like another analogy for this is like project management and product management. I see project management and product management on like a spectrum where there's an appropriate tension, which is that project management is very much about like reduction of known risk, not making mistakes, like not making the same mistake twice, like making sure that resources are not like misallocated, a bunch of stuff like that, right?
Yeah.
Product management is much more about pushing the envelope around innovation, embracing uncertainty, and not dealing with that, like dealing with risk in a different way, which is like, how do we option risk to our benefit, right? And the thing is that when I was at Microsoft, a program manager position was both of those things, right? I would do product management work and I would build Gantt charts and do like discussions with engineers to figure out like, how do we resource allocate in this particular thing? Now, I think that's a bad thing because the truth is you should be having that tension and argument between those two different roles. They're both valuable roles as separate things. And you have to decide somewhere along the spectrum between them. I'd say the same thing happens with product management and engineering. Engineering should be, you know, figuring out how to build something. They should be figuring out how to maintain it over time. And they should be thinking about like, just how does the system evolve, right? Like where are the common failure cases? In the case of machine learning, it's even weirder, which is like, how do we build the right environment to then train a model that does the right thing, right? But product managers are on a different part of that spectrum where it's like, actually, I don't care all that much about how you build it. I care more, is this going to solve a problem for a customer? And when we have a disagreement about like, we want to solve this problem, and one way to solve it is a way that the engineer says, but it's going to take way too long. The question becomes, what is the trade-off we need to make between those two people? And if you have a product manager that's very close to the technical side of the world, I think they make the wrong types of trade-offs. And so that's my argument is like, I think, you know, now my, you know, my VP of product, you know, brought up a really good point is like, you know, so how do you have these discussions? And I think like one nuance I would want to make is that we need to have a shared language, right? That's absolutely true. It doesn't always have to be pure technical. It doesn't always have to be pure customer problem, but there's something in between that we need to find an agreement about as far as how to talk about things. And then just the second thing I would just add here is that, you know, so does product management, I think like in some ways it's really interesting to me is that, so is product management, like what are the base skills that you need to know? And I don't know, maybe like, I wouldn't necessarily say that you have to be an expert at something like statistics to be able to work well with a data scientist, right? I would say that when we talk about like the philosophical or strategic discussions, maybe that's the core of a product manager is actually like, how do we have good discourse? How do we ask the right questions? How do we challenge the right types of norms, or not even norms, but like false mindsets that we may have? So anyways, that's my thought on technicalness for PMs. And I think it does a disservice to the developers and the engineers and, you know, the architects, frankly, where they are the technical ones and we should be asking them the good questions.
Yeah. And in a lot of ways, it's sort of, it's almost setting unfair low expectations of the technical teams, or sort of like unfairly underestimating like their ability to like meet you with a shared language, like as experts in the field and, you know, topic at hand, like, you know, great technical folks can kind of find the path to communicate with you. It's sort of silly to assume that they wouldn't be able to.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
And I think like that's the thing, is that maybe that shared language is the part that we should be talking about, because it's like, yeah, I do need to know terminology about machine learning to be able to have a good discussion with an engineer, but also like finding those shared analogies helps us maybe like reframe things in some way. And yeah, I agree with you. There's like, once you start getting to being a very senior engineer, you know, we have a title called Uber Technical Lead, which is like a very senior kind of individual contributor, usually engineer. Like once you get to that level, you are thinking an awful lot about like, are we building the right thing? Not just like, are we building well? And so I think there's something very interesting about that. And yeah, I think all those people that are engineers, they do aspire, I think a lot of them, to at least do a better job of building the right thing, because they see after like a couple of years in the industry, if they build something that's not used by anyone, it's a waste of time. Right. And so I think they want to have those discussions too, but we need to have the right types of, and by the way, like, I think this is why using like the Venn diagram for product management is like a disservice to the field as well, because it's not just like, it's not just engineering and business and design, but it's like, there's lots of stakeholders or teams that we need to build appropriate tensions with. Like I tend to use like legal and compliance as like an example of that, is that if you did everything that legal wanted you to do to reduce risk in the marketplace, you would never do anything new. But working with them to figure out like, what are the appropriate, not necessarily risks, but like, what is it that we should do because we know it's the right thing to do, right? That's one thing. And then there's this idea of like legal compliance, which is what reports do we need to build, or who do we need to notify, or who do we have to have review things? That's very different than the idea of like not being able to do a particular feature. Like, and I worked, you know, at Facebook Reality Labs on the Portal device, and there were a lot of things just around like biometric recognition that were very challenging, mostly because of the baggage that Facebook brought to things like biometric recognition, but appropriately, right? And so we had to have a lot of conversations with all these teams, like legal, security, privacy, safety, compliance, and because the truth is like we needed to take a lot of care in building the right thing, and so. That's what I'd say is like, I think we need to do a better job of building those types of trade-off discussions. Engineering is one, but that's like saying that I need to be like a legal expert, right?
Exactly.
And that seems ridiculous as well, right? Or a design expert, that seems ridiculous. So to me, it's like being overly technical as a PM. And here's the thing is I think what some of the PMs on my team kind of are kind of upset about is that they are very technical people, right? They themselves could probably be architects, right? Like they are very smart. They're very technically adept. But I guess what I'm trying to make the argument for is that I want them to focus on something that actually is within their role more appropriately. Now, there's always hybrid roles. I've done lots of hybrid roles where I've been like a business development and product management hybrid. And I've enjoyed that type of role, but I found that like I preferred product management rather than business development. And so I'm a very, you know, friendly BD person and love doing partnership discussions, things like that. But to me, it's like product management is the role that I've chosen.
Yeah. I mean, it's all a great discussion to have. And I've seen a lot of PMs and personally I fall into this too, where it's like, you can get so almost obsessed with like untangling the input from the technical team, or sort of like decoding like the conversation from the technical team, that you forget like really your job is to do the other side. Like your job is to go to technical or legal or whatever it is and say like, great, thank you for like coming to me with your sort of context and concerns and commentary, and here's mine, and here's where product management is coming from, and here's our priorities, here's what we found, here's sort of my version of bringing the, you know, my perspective to you. And a lot of folks sort of can get caught up in the former and forget the latter in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's the real problem, is that as product managers, we are meant to be decision facilitators in some way. I think project management does this in a slightly different way too. But there is like an interesting point, which is like, who is the business decision maker in the end? And so a lot of people will end up using kind of, you know, sometimes it's product management. At Google, it's a very engineering driven organization. Others will use a GM model. And so I think like this deciding how to decide is also like a really important question, because, you know, I've always believed in something that's called consent over consensus as kind of a default mode, which what that really means is that in a cross-functional team, and this is called balanced team as well as like a moniker, but that as a cross-functional team, each person has a slightly different kind of domain for decision making, and so engineers will make technical decisions, right? I can give them feedback on the technical decision, but they make the final technical decision. And so I think like I've seen this pattern where product managers that fancy themselves as very technical, they will question everything that the engineer does, and so like the estimate they give, they'll say like, is it really that much time? And you know, like, and rather than saying like, okay, well, if we had to do something that like if we only had a weekend to do something, what would we be able to get done, or what could we experiment with? Those are appropriate questions. But saying, I think your estimate is wrong is like basically removing this whole decision-making authority and kind of agency autonomy from their role. And so that I think really worries me a lot in these like highly technical PMs. And so, I mean, I think I've definitely gotten in clashes with people where they're like, you know, can you squeeze out more work from this team? And I'm like, no, I trust the team, right? Like the team decides what they're appropriate to do. And actually, like, again, I'm not going to go on a rant about estimation and versus forecasting and things like that. But, I think like it's more appropriate that we say like, let's just work on the most important thing right now. Let's have like a strategy to be able to take us in the right direction. And I would argue that that strategy and roadmap and backlog need to be aligned right now rather than some future looking thing. And so from that perspective, I think once you start to have that kind of framework, I think we start to remove all this need for like micromanagement of the engineering team and how they estimate, right? Like, let's just work on stuff and let's figure out when the appropriate time is to release it.
Yeah, I mean, I love that. I love that note around deciding how to decide, and I think that's such like it's like the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns, and it's like sort of how do we come to these decisions? I mean, what else? I mean, anything else that sort of like helps you sort of wrestle with that question?
Yeah, I mean, I think like just breaking out from the fact that so like in both Facebook and Google, I found that they were very consensus driven. I'd say Google is very, very consensus driven. And that means that everybody kind of has to agree to move forward with something. That is the default here. But I would argue that there's many other ways to make decisions, right? And so there's a really great app that I believe called the Decider, which is essentially there's also like a Slack kind of plugin and everything. But at the very bottom of the screen, like in this Decider app, they have the 8 different types of decision-making frameworks that are they kind of like identify. There's definitely more, and I've read like textbooks on decision-making and some of the most dry reading I've ever read. But like, you know, consensus is one, right? Another one is like consent, where it's less about the idea of everybody agreeing, and it's more about just like, does anybody veto this? Right.
Got it.
There's also autocratic decision making, which is that this person makes the decision. And then my favorite one that I've been exploring a lot more, and I've done some talks about this, but like stochastic or randomness in decision making as a way to like get at. I've done some talks about this, but I think like a lot of the bias we end up having is because we're using preconceived notions that may no longer be valid. And so using randomness, especially in like ideation and like the idea of like divergent and convergent thinking, I think gets you into this realm of like, you're able to actually consider more. Now, there are times, right, when if the team is at an impasse and there's literally everybody's like, we have no idea which one is a better decision right now. Honestly, flipping a coin and moving forward is probably a better way to deal with things than it is to be stuck in that gridlock. And there's been lots of books that have talked about like the value of information over time, like How to Measure Anything is like a really good book around this. But like there's a certain point that you just need to say, we're just going to move forward. And honestly, like I think people should feel more comfortable with the fact that like, hey, my intuition says this is the right way to go, and it's my decision as a product manager, or it's my decision as an engineer. So we're just going to move forward with that, and we'll adjust as time goes on. But I don't know. I mean, here's another interesting weird tactic is that if you really want to know what decision you want, if it's like a this or that type of decision, when you flip a coin, you will know when the coin is in the air, which decision you really hope will happen.
Yeah, it's like, what's that gut feeling, you know?
Exactly.
Like the game's on the line, like, what do you hope it is right now before I lift my hand off the coin? You're just like, you might catch that. Yeah, that's great advice. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that comes from decision science a lot of the time is like, you know, they're usually not just black and white decisions. There's usually like nuance. And so if people are having a hard time deciding, I say like, can you like load up 6 different kind of plans that could work, right? And then you can do the same thing with like rolling a dice. And so anyways, like I think there's like a bunch of tactics like that help you kind of understand things better. People feel really uncomfortable using randomness though, because they feel like it's just very flippant. But I would argue again that there's like some real value in using certain techniques like this within the team dynamic. It's just problem is like sometimes you have to do it secretly. So like sometimes I would just like flip a coin secretly around these types of things. But anyways, like I think there's a lot about intuition that product management really needs to build over time too.
That's so interesting. I'm going to start trying this out. So if anyone on the team's listening, you see me like flipping my camera off so I can flip a coin in the background. But it's interesting. Like I've done some of this as you talk about it. I realize I've done this like in my personal life, and I think a lot of folks who sort of, I don't know if you're like me and can kind of get to be kind of like a heady analytical person, you can get into the trap of analysis paralysis. I'll do that around just like personal chores and stuff like that, and this sort of something I've been telling myself lately on things like that and using it to work a little bit is just like, picking something and having it be the not ideal thing is more ideal than considering, continuing stagnation, continuing to be sort of stuck in analysis paralysis. Like, even if it's, hypothetically ideal, like the 10th most ideal thing I could be doing, like, that's better than doing nothing. It's better than continuing to sort of just like stew in paralysis because you can't make a decision. So that's great. But I had not thought about sort of implementing that to the team and kind of bringing that to the workplace. And it sounds like there's, kind of a whole world of kind of thinking and text around that. That's super interesting.
There's been kind of like an evolution for me around this. Like Kahneman, who did, the thinking fast and slow, really rails against these ideas of like biases that we have in our thinking processes. And there's a reason why we have them. It's because we need to make decisions with little information and a fast time period, things like that. There's a reason why we have these biases. And then there's someone, Geigerziner, who talks a lot about like how there's value in heuristics. And so a lot of the time in like the medical profession, they'll use kind of fast and thin heuristic to make decisions, like to do things like diagnosis, for example, because it's very effective, right? It doesn't always help in the edge case, or not edge cases, but like special cases. But there's a really interesting study that I recently came across, which was that for all of these like kind of cognitive biases that we have, a lot of them are actually fixed through team dynamics. And so there was a particular cognitive task that they would give people. And if people did it by themselves, it was like 20% of the time they would get it right. If you put them in a team, 80% of the time they would get it right as a team. And so I think what's really interesting about this is that we work in teams, we make decisions in teams. There maybe the product manager is like forcing a decision, not always making the decision, right? Or helping guide or facilitate the decision. But I think there's something that we definitely have a lot of work to do, that especially in a world that is partially remote or relying more on asynchronous documents. I think there's a real value to how do we do a better job of discourse through these documents to get to better decisions as a group. Because right now, like definitely there's been some stuff around like Google, like we use Google Docs and there's a lot of commenting that happens on these Google Docs. It doesn't work out quite the way you want it to, right? It feels kind of overwhelming sometimes as the document owner because it's all this feedback. Some of the time it's like, should this person even be giving feedback on this document? Like, and then there's this whole issue about like, Derek Silver has talked a lot about like how managers should not give their 2 cents on things because people see them as kind of like marching orders or requests. And so there's all these like weird dynamics in the async world that I think like, there's a lot of work for us to do and discover. And it's something I'm starting to dive into right now is like, how do we do a better job of asynchronous discourse so that we get the benefits of team dynamics rather than just this idea of like individual thought. So I think there's something really interesting about that as well, that we have not explored enough.
I think that's great. I mean, I myself too have been kind of playing with what are the right ways and how do we bring in more of like the synchronous work when the time is right, because there is such magic to that. And like Google Docs is a great example.
That's right.
I'm a huge fan, and I'm a huge fan of asynchronous feedback and editing. I spend a lot of time in Google Docs doing editing, feedback, working with writers, always have. And, to kind of call back to my earlier reference from my newspaper days, one of the most helpful moments in that environment when I was, a reporter is when an editor would say, hey, slide your chair over. We're going to actually work on this together. We're going to go line by line and you're going to sort of see how I think. And so I always sort of see that as like the kind of like next level of a lot of Google Docs feedback, or what it could be, whatever. I think engineers do a great job with, they call it pair programming. They do a great job with this. And it's like, how can we sort of, even in the remote world, slide our chairs next to each other and kind of work through this together? Because that's something that I've never seen replicated in, kind of an async moment.
And we don't even do this right synchronously sometimes, which is that like whenever someone asks me, is this a good roadmap, or is this a good PRD, or is this a good whatever, right? I ask, well, how have you actually experimented? How have you done research to decide whether that's the case or not? Because it doesn't matter what I think, honestly. Like I have a lot of opinions about things, but honestly, like what has been your people's reaction to your roadmap? Have they referenced it? Like if you like in Google Docs, there's the ability to look at like activity on your document. Do people still go to it? Right? Like, do people link to it? Do people talk about it? Like, do you bring it up in every meeting? And so I think we're not, and then there's the other side too, is like, have you ever just taken this document, shown it to someone that you think would really need to get value out of this, had them read through it, and then respond to you about what the most important thing was they got out of it. Right. So it's like usability testing for documents. And so I think there's a lack of that type of thing within async documents. Like I've seen people where I joined this one team for a couple months where they had put like, if you read this, I will buy you lunch if you tell me that you read to this point in the document. Right. So they're just trying to get like engagement metrics this way. And so I got the free lunch because I actually read people's documents. But I think there's like something that we could do better about this async stuff. Like if you look at YouTube, there's actually like, what are the most popular parts of this like video? Like what are the most popular parts of this document? Right. There's some people in like the space like Coda and a bunch, anyways, a bunch of different document groups that are trying to go after this, network groups like Notion and that type of thing. I think there's a lot more we could do around this. That is like, how do we do a better job of that idea of like, how do you understand whether this document is valuable or not? We don't have a lot of good metrics about that yet, or even good qualitative information. And so anyways, I think there's something really interesting in that realm as well that we need to do way more about.
Oh, 100%. This could be a totally separate, conversation. Absolutely. But it's a great topic. And it's like, I really saw up close at Atlassian, with as distributed and sort of, by continental that company is, along with, Confluence, like extremely heavily like writing and document fueled culture, and sort of like seeing the potential of that. And it's like, you can tell like there's some magic in this, and there's still like, there's more territory out there, I think. And I think you're kind of touching on that too. It's like, there's a lot of potential for, the kind of, the power of the document and teams using it the right way.
Absolutely.
I tell you what, Chris, I said at the beginning, and I think I was right, that we could probably spend 4 hours on 11 given topics here. But we'll be respectful of your time today. I appreciate it. Let me wrap up with a super fun one. This can just be quick. Because I like to ask product people about, about products they like. It leads to interesting answers. Any products you've been trying out recently that you're interested in, or you think are, compelling, cool, and this can be something at work or just sort of out in the world?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I've done some writing about this before too, about kind of like all the devices that are inside our homes. And so that's something that like, I think I still worry that like the devices that are in our kitchen, like I have in my kitchen, a Google Home Hub that my kids are able to play music on, and it skews the recommendations that I get on my Spotify account. And so I don't know if it's like something that I've liked recently, but it's been something that's been very top of mind for me, is how do we do a better job of building technology into our homes that our kids, our spouses, like our visitors can actually, play around with in a way that is meaningful for them. But, I for me, it's interesting too, because like, maybe this is a bit of a non-answer for your question, because, I think of all technology as just intermediating humans. And so from that perspective, like it's more about the interactions that I have. So I tend to have like very boring answers in that, like, VT, like video conferencing, Google Docs, like Twitter, LinkedIn, Slack for the communities that I'm part of. Like those are all things that it's like, for me, it's about this interaction in some way between people. And that actually is most meaningful to me. So unfortunately do not play around with like a lot of weird stuff. At least not as, or I'll try it out and then it kind of like just fades in the background for me a lot of the time. So I'm sorry if that's not the answer you're looking for.
No, it's there's no wrong answer, and that's a really that's a really great slice of commentary. It's definitely appreciated. Well, thanks for joining us, Chris. Like, really appreciate the time. Outstanding conversation. If folks want to learn more from you or connect or say hi, what's where can they maybe find more?
So I'd be happy to connect on LinkedIn. If people are going to try any of these things, I'd love to hear where that is, like how that goes for them. And then I do tweet occasionally on Twitter. My handle is ChrisBot with a Z and a T at the end. It's a long story. And, but yeah, so and I'm also on a bunch of different like product management and product ops Slack channels. And so anyways, cool. I'm always happy to engage. Yeah. I'd always love to hear how things work out for people. And yeah, I'm always trying to get back to the community because I've gotten so much help from other product managers inside the community. And so I'm always happy to engage and connect with people.
Awesome. Appreciate it. And if anyone listened to the all the way to the end of this, reach out to me. I'll buy you lunch. So
exactly.
Awesome. Thanks for being here today, Chris. Really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right.